All right, everyone, I'm excited to introduce my next guest, star of theater, TV, and film, the girl from Uncle, Heart to Heart, Herbie Rides Again, and so much more. Founder of the William Holden Wildlife Foundation, author of One from the Heart. Please welcome to the show, Stefanie Powers.
Hello, Jeff. Are you of Polish origin? Your name is what? Dvoskin?
Dwoskin. I might be more
Dvoskin.
Russian. Might be Russian Polish. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, probably. The W mine. So mine on my birth certificate it says Stefania Zofia Federkiewicz.
Yes,
You can understand why they changed it.
How about we go with Powers?
Yeah, there you go. No, well, it was another name for and that one got changed.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's Powers is definitely a lot. I saw that when I was doing the research. You're a Polish origin name, and yeah, I wasn't even gonna try to pronounce it, but thank you for
Well, I spoke Polish actually before I spoke English. So, and now I speak it, really haltingly. It's a very difficult language. I think it's somebody described it as a language in search of a vowel. So you can understand it's very hard to pronounce.
All right. Well, we're just for anyone listening, we're gonna move forward with only English. We're doing this whole interview in English.
Oh, you don't like risk, eh? You don't want to take a chance.
Diving in for an interview when I get a chance, I dove into your book, and then you start to like find things, and so sometimes like you uncover certain things that you didn't know were around. And one of the things that I found that I loved in researching specifically Heart to Heart was Adam Scott and Amy Poehler did a shot by shot remake. I know they interviewed you guys as well, but they
fabulous. Did you see it?
Oh yeah.
Is it on the it was fabulous. I mean, they really spared no expense, but they were so spot on. They got the absolute essence of the two characters, don't you think?
Yeah, it was because I had just watched the openings again, because it's funny because the theme song to Heart, though I remembered most of it, the one line that sticks, how you like you have certain lines from certain movies or what have you that just stick in your head. Like there isn't like I bet a month doesn't go by where I won't see two people together, and in my head I go, because when they met, it was murder. For no reason other than that. That's like the line is just, it's like the way he says murder is Lionel. It's just like,
and Lionel did it so well, didn't he?
So well. I think so well because I realized in watching some of the season one of Heart to Heart that the opening is slightly different. The narration is slightly different. And I think it's like their hobby was murder, but they're like, oh, they must have loved the way he said murder because it kept getting rewritten with they didn't lose that murder with his voice.
They said they changed it, really? I thought it was always, and when they met, it was murder.
No, if you go watch the first season, like it says, because it's something about like their hobby is murder. Yeah, because I was like, oh wow, because all of a sudden I thought, am I having a Mandela effect?
That doesn't sound as good. No, that certainly doesn't sound as good.
No, and your intro got a little different too, because yours was a little more simple, and then it eventually became, this is Miss H. She's gorgeous, and she's one lady that knows how to take care of herself. And like that line wasn't in the original one either.
I know that I never cared for that one either. But then that's just
But the shot for shot remake was incredible. I loved it.
That was very funny. They were really, really good.
Yeah,
we both got a big kick out of it.
That was super fun to just accidentally discover. There's so much. I have like
yes, I know. I've been around a long time.
Notes upon notes upon notes. We can work our way back up to Heart to Heart. I mean, super impressed. I mean, of all the famous people that you've worked with, would you put Herbie the Love Bug right at the top? Because I was so impressed.
Well, it was very interesting. I was under contract to Columbia Pictures when I was 16. I worked with Jimmy MacArthur, whose mother happened to be the first lady of the American theater. That's a pretty daunting title to have. But Jimmy was, never, affected by any of that. And so here we were, walking on a sound stage, where the first lady of the American theater is going to act beside a Volkswagen car. So I thought, well, if she can do it, so can I. I mean, she was delighted. She was delighted to be doing that film because it reached a whole new audience, an audience she'd never reached before. She said she couldn't really work again in the theater because of the dust, that it affected her so badly that she really found it so much better to work on film. But I asked her again whether or not that was true, because we spent weeks on a sound stage at Disney Studios. They had perfected. They were one of the first companies that ever did a combination of live action and animation. And they perfected a kind of, it wasn't a green screen, it wasn't a blue screen, it was a kind of yellowish cyan colored screen that they perfected. And what they would do is they would have two 35mm cameras slapped together, and they would be simultaneously going through filming while the film went through the camera and was exposed in this light. One had us only with the no background, and the other camera had us cut out, a kind of cutout of us, so it could get the background and not us. It was very complicated, obviously, by today's standards, because we think of everything as being digitalized, and so it's all instant mashed potatoes, but then this was such an incredible technology, but it was very difficult to work with because you couldn't move from side to side. So you had to be pretty much stationary. And then they would do one or two lines of dialogue. And then you'd have to move to another position. And then you could do one or two lines of dialogue in that position. So even as difficult as that was, she found it enjoyable.
It sounds like a fascinating process of how they shot that. So it's not, so the car really couldn't do all that.
I'm so sorry. No, I hate to spoil your illusion. No.
Oh no, we better not talk about Santa Claus either. Then. But that was really cool. So the villain in that was interesting because it was like Keenan Wynn.
Yes.
Because his character was also in Son of Flubber and The Absent-Minded Professor. It was interesting that like back then that they were still kind of doing those crossovers. So he was like the bad guy in all the films.
It was really interesting because Keenan was he was a wild man. He was a great motorcycle enthusiast, and he would ride to work and everywhere on this motorcycle with a sidecar. Sometimes he'd have somebody in it, sometimes it wouldn't be. And the sidecar is very dangerous. It's you have to really know what you're doing. And later on, I did another film with him. So he was a known quantity, and he was really quite an eccentric. Never really very much like the characters he played.
I find like a lot of people I talk to are like, like if they're a very specific type of character, sometimes they're the exact opposite in real life. Like, especially if they're like evil people, then they're usually the nicest people. And you got to
Billy.
marry Ken Berry.
Yes, Ken Berry, who was, and I think he never really was used. His timing was bad because the great period of the movie musical, where he could have sung and tap danced, which was one of the things he did best of all. He was a great song and dance man, but he was hired more as a comedian on film and in television, so he never really got to show his real talent. He was in something called the Billy Barnes Review, which played in the theater for years and years and years. There were several casts that, but I think Diane Worley, is it
Yeah, that
Diane?
sounds right. Yeah.
Diane Worley. I think she was in the Billy Barnes Review. Ken was in the Billy Barnes Review. The woman who became his wife was in the Billy Barnes. It was an incredible. It was kind of, I suppose you might call it LA's version of Second City. What Second City was to Chicago, the Billy Barnes Review was to LA.
Very nice. I remember him from Mama's Family also.
Uh-huh.
Okay. That's up. All right. So your memoir, One from the Heart, dove into that. So you say we got at Columbia at 16. So you're 15, you talk about like starting to dance and you had quite a dance crew with Natalie Wood was in there as well. It's like, so you move fast. Like you were discovered right away.
I guess you might say so. Yes. Yeah.
Well, 1 minute you're dancing, the next minute you're right meeting with Blake Edwards, and then Experiment in Terror, and then that led to your 7 years at Columbia, right?
Yes,
Oh,
15 movies in 5 years. I was at Columbia for 5 years. They loaned me out, and so I did about 3 movies a year.
I wanted to ask you about the loan out thing. So when you're on contract, they just own you. Like it's like a set price. We're paying you X amount. So that you could be making $400 a week or whatever. They could loan you out for $1 million and they could
I
make a
was
million.
making I was making $400 a week. I was. That's exactly what my salary was. And then they would loan me out to different studios to do different roles, and they were paid a much higher sum, and not quite $1 million, but they were paid a much higher sum, and I still got my $400 a week.
Okay, so they were able to recoup their costs with you, or they could make
Well,
money
that was
off
the
of you.
system. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was the system at the time. They did own you. And so when they decided that they got an offer from MGM and after about 5 years to buy me out of my contract, if they would sell me, sell me to MGM to do The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. So they sold me, and I didn't really have anything to say about it. Actually, I was quite happy because The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. was a fantastic opportunity. I'd never done television. I'd done 1 or 2 guest shots in my hiatus period. I had never done a television series, and I'd never done television in those days, which was, we was rather cumbersome. Today we have technology that makes it possible, if you can use the technology, to film a lot in one day. We had a 35 millimeter film cameras that needed lights, and the film was slower. We had 14-hour days every day, and we would turn out an hour show every 7 days, and we filmed 29 episodes each season. Can you imagine?
That's a lot.
29 episodes in a season. Today they can barely, I mean, 8, 10, what is it? Eight episodes for some of the streaming shows,
Yeah,
if you're
sometimes
lucky.
six, sometimes only six. Yeah, 6 to 8, maybe 10.
in spite of all of the AI and all the CG and all of that that's available, they still don't, they're not able to quite make it happen.
Well, you guys worked your butts off and made it happen. So,
We did.
The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. So we got April Dancer. So this was a spinoff of The Man from U.N.C.L.E.
And, at the time, nobody made a big deal about this, but it was only until, years and years and years later when somebody was saying, we're going to have a retrospective of the pioneers of television. Would you join us? And I said, well, I'm hardly a pioneer. And they said, oh, no, no, no. The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. was the first hour-long television series starring a woman ever. Can you imagine that?
That's amazing.
We didn't, it wasn't even an issue. It was just that's the way it was. And I mean, think of all the things we could have capitalized on.
So nobody realized it? You didn't realize it at the time? It was only years later when they kind of said, hey, by the way, you're a groundbreaker.
That's it.
Oh, man. So this was originally in The Man from U.N.C.L.E. set up as one of those backdoor pilots. So Marianne Mobley was April Dancer, and Norman Fell was Mark Slate, Mr. Roper.
Mr. Roper, yes.
Yeah.
Well, and Marianne was a neighbor of mine. She lived about 3 houses away, and we became very, very good friends later in life. We sorted it out. I said, look, it wasn't my choice. I wasn't trying to get your job. That's what it was. The studios did this and that. And of course, she understood it. She was the sweetest, loveliest lady who was Miss America at one point.
Oh, wow.
And she fought her cancer brilliantly. She had 2 dogs, and we would walk our dogs together. I had 3 dogs. When she died, her daughter's husband didn't want to take the dogs because they barked. I said, get rid of him and take the dogs. I mean, how ridiculous. So I said, without question, bring the dogs to my house, because my dogs, we'd walk together, so my dogs knew them. So suddenly I had 5 dogs, and I still have one of them.
That's wonderful. That's so awesome.
He was one of the dogs that was barking when you called me, or I called, we hooked up. That belonged to Marianne.
That's a great story, and you're awesome. That's really cool. That's really cool. I remember the first dog my wife and I got. We from the Humane Society. It was this big dog, English Springer Spaniel, collie mix, beautiful, and just kind of sat there and looked at us and snuggled with us, and it was like, oh, this is our dog. And we get home, never stopped barking. Like, knew not to bark until we got him home. But we kept him. Don't worry. Looking at the Girl from U.N.C.L.E. And, oh, by the way, like sometimes I was just talking to Lynn Moody, and she was one of the original. She was in the back, she was in the backdoor pilot for the Jeffersons on All in the Family, and none of them in the backdoor pilot, none of those characters that we know now as the Jeffersons and all the characters, none of them were the characters from the backdoor pilot. Yeah, the backdoor pilot. Yeah, I mean, so
they were completely recast.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, so it was like, so
that happened a lot, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like, it's probably wasn't, they probably do it, forget it, and then they start the real casting. It was interesting because it was like this is a product of its time. I would like TV Guide. You were on the cover of TV Guide, and you can correct me if this is wrong, because I can only trust the internet so far, right? But it was like it referred to your weight, and it said that you keep at this weight by doing 11 minutes of Royal Canadian Air Force exercise daily. And I was like, I mean, it makes sense that they would say it at that time, because I think that's what they did, but it's horrible. But it was just so
no, but it's true.
Is it true?
Yeah. Have you ever heard of the Royal Canadian Air Force exercises?
No, but they would never say that about a guy, probably, right? They would never.
Well, they wouldn't say what he weighed or anything. They would today, probably. But the Royal Canadian Air Force exercises were, and still are, an extraordinary way to stay in shape.
All
That's
right.
a
Well,
good idea. I haven't thought about that in a long time. I haven't done them in a long time. I don't know if I'm fit enough to be able to do them, but it is an 11-minute workout and you really do work.
all right. Well, I guess I'm going to check it out then.
Yes, do.
Well, I'm glad I brought
All
it up.
Canadian Air Force exercises.
All right. All right. So, all right. So you were John Wayne's daughter. That's awesome. And
Yeah,
McLintock.
I was thrilled with that one.
You loved Westerns. I read that in
Oh,
your book. And
yeah.
so that must have been amazing to then work with and be John Wayne's daughter in a movie.
Well, and Maureen O'Hara. Let's not forget
Sure.
Maureen.
Maureen O'Hara. Yes. Yes. Sorry.
And all the people that were in that movie, and that great cast of characters. You know, I was talking to somebody the other day, Rob Ward, who you should interview because he's the man who sort of keeps. He's the keeper of the flame of the Western movies. He has an archive and he interviews everybody about who's been in Western movies. And we were talking about it, and he was going to see Patrick Wayne that day. And I said, well, give Patrick my love. Isn't it amazing that the two of us are the only ones left alive from that from that film? It was a privilege to be working with those people. They were all of that period. They were in every every possible John Ford movie. Andy McLaughlin, who was Victor McLaughlin's son, was directing it. Patrick Wayne was in it, and Michael Wayne was producing it. So it was really a kind of family unit. It was quite a, I've never had that experience before or since, because everybody had something to do with John Ford, who did come for a few days to take over when Andy McLaughlin got sick. And let me tell you, that was, it's in the book. I think I have a detailed description of what it was like when he arrived. It was, it was a full production.
I think you said you were relieved that you weren't in any of those scenes that day.
Yeah, I was sort of hiding.
Oh man, too funny. You mentioned Cliff Robertson a lot. I've always loved Cliff Robertson. You mentioned Roddy McDowell a lot. There's a whole. I know you worked with.
So Clifford and I did quite a few movies together and quite a few TV miniseries together. Washington Behind Closed Doors was one of them. I think that was one of the beginning of the long form TV series. It was very successful. I mean, he had known me since we did the Interns movie when I was just under contract. I think it was the second the second movie I did, and he was this. I had loved the movie Picnic. So to me, he was this. Of course, I was in love with William Holden before I was in love with William Holden. So that movie was just breathtaking. So I was very impressed with him, and he was, you know, kind of. I was his kid, so then we did another movie together, and then over the years we became such good friends, and he wound up calling his daughter Stefanie.
Oh,
So that was nice.
that's awesome. That's really cool. He must have liked you so much.
Well, I liked him too.
The movie. It's funny when I was reading the book. I'm like, oh, I didn't realize Stephanie was in Gone with the Wind. You weren't, but the I kept reading Gone with the West. For
Oh,
some
Gone with
reason,
the
my
West.
brain, yeah, for some reason, my eyes were scanning it, my brain just filled it in, you know. But Gone with the West with James Caan and Sammy Davis Jr. But I wanted to actually ask you about seeing Don Rickles.
That was so funny. Oh God, that was so funny. We were all billeted, this entire movie company, at a downtown hotel. And in those days, the downtown hotels were kind of on the lower end of things. But our production company made a deal. And so we were all billeted there. And Jimmy invited me to go to meet Rickles. We were supposed to go and see his show, but we were working late, so we didn't make it. We had to go back and at least shower and change because we were out dusty, dirty, and all of that. And so we met him in the coffee shop of Caesar's Palace, this grand hotel. And as we walk in, Rickles' booming voice from the back of the coffee shop says, "Oh, there they are. James Caan and Stefanie Powers, big stars staying at the Mint."
Don Rickles is the funniest person in the world.
Oh, God, he was great. And
So
he was a
fun.
sweetheart also. I mean, once again, as you say, sometimes the villains are the nicest people. Well, the comedians are very special people. And Don was, his stock in trade was to insult you lovingly with humor. But as a person, he was a pussycat. He was a lovely, lovely man, and his wife was just great. And I knew his wife when she was ran the office of an agent at an agency that I was under contract to, and so this was a very small town at one time. If you were in the business, under contract, or part of the firmament, everybody knew everybody, and everybody's paths crisscrossed. And a lot of people were married to each other. I mean, everybody married each other, and everybody. But I think it always was a very, very small world. Now it's a lot larger, because there's so many more people, and that tradition is not there. People don't come into the business through the studio system, and so they learn it in a very different way.
So, of the things you learn when reading a book, since you, I know you didn't have it for very long, but one of the very first voices of Hal in 2001:
Okay.
A Space Odyssey. I love that story. That was great.
Yeah, I mean, what happened was that Stanley Kubrick he had a voice he wanted Hal, the computer, to have, which was, what's the word I'm looking for?
Androgynous.
Androgynous. There you go. And the studio MGM back in Los Angeles was trying desperately to have a word or two, an opinion that was going to be listened to by Stanley, who was making this phenomenal film that nobody at MGM understood. And so they said the voice was too gay. So in those days, that was an issue. So he said, in retaliation, I was on the set a lot. So he said, and he knew I was an actor, and so he said, you rehearse with them, you play Hal and rehearse with them, and then they recorded it. And then I was immediately fired, and he got this wonderful baritone voice of a classical British, classically trained actor called Nigel Davenport, who was wonderful. It was a very, very, very low and rich voice. And he did it for a day, and he was fired. And then Stanley got the voice he wanted, which is the androgynous voice that you hear in the movie today.
What could have been? What could have been?
Yes, but anyway, it was all I could say. It was such a privilege to be around that set and to have known Stanley for at least as much as I did. I'm still in touch with his widow, who on her own is an extraordinary painter. And Stanley is buried on their property in England.
Oh wow. It's amazing that you were there and got to witness some of that. I mean, it's one of the most iconic movies of all time.
And it's so innovative. I mean, it's important to always remind people that when they see that and they look at the spaceship and they see all the readouts in the spaceship in the centrifuge wheel, and they see the screens reflecting all this digital readout. It didn't exist. There was nothing digital. That was done through animation. That was done by a special effects genius called Doug Trumbo. And it was projected through a 16 millimeter projector into the set. When you think about the ingenuity that Stanley, all the innovations that he employed, it's quite astonishing. And it would be so much better if, before anybody sees this film, if they can put some kind of a disclaimer saying, please understand that this movie was made before digitalization existed or computers of any kind.
I find that like some of that ingenuity and some of the practical effects, they make it better. It's those movies that do those things well are, so some things can be too CGI'd or too digitized, and it
Oh my
takes a.
God. And I just saw a demonstration of the new digitized background sets that can be made that will move with you. So if you're walking along a street, you won't know the difference between if you're in Paris or not in Paris, because they can have people moving in the background and it will move with you. So it's all you don't ever need to go to Paris. You don't that's never going to be a factor anymore. So for
Well, I think I'm going to Paris in a little bit, so I'm still gonna go. But like, because my wife is gonna really want. I can't. I don't think I can tell her like, "Hey, honey, we can just project it around the
we can
house.
project it.
We could
Well,
save some money. Just actually, that'd probably be more expensive."
and bring takeout. Sit by the Seine and eat your takeout.
Oh man. Should we jump into? Oh, you know what I wanted to ask you first before we get into heart to heart? The phenomenon of the '70s tennis pro celebrity tennis tournaments. It's just funny when you
Yeah.
read things and like, oh, this was a thing. We did these things, and it was
It was
like,
a thing. I even played a charity game, a doubles charity game in the Albert Hall in London with Vijay Armitage as my partner. So it was a celebrity pro tennis tournament for charity. But we were inside the Albert Hall. They took out these movable orchestra seats and put a tennis court. I don't know if you've ever been in the Albert Hall, but it's one of the most iconic buildings of London, and it's a magnificent space where concerts are done. And I've performed twice in the Albert Hall, and it's an amazing space.
oh wow, that sounds awesome. Maybe we should get those charity things to come back. Now I
They
think it
were
would be
fun. They were
pickleball these days,
fabulous.
right?
They were really fabulous. It was great fun.
I think it would be fun to watch Charlton Heston play tennis and you play tennis. It's like
Can you
I
imagine?
can
He was a wonderful tennis player. Clint Eastwood, good tennis player.
I can see it. I can see it. That would be fun. That would be fun. Okay, so speaking of fun, let's talk about the iconic Jennifer Hart. All right, so you're doing a play, Cyrano de Bergerac, with Stacy Keach, and just like anything, when all good things are happening, they tend to pile on each other at the same time. So then they come to you with this idea that they want you for Heart to Heart as well. Aaron Spelling, who at this time pretty much owns everything, right? And everything is Aaron Spelling, right?
Well, Aaron Spelling and Leonard Goldberg was his partner. They had so many successful shows in primetime television for ABC that they used to call it Aaron. ABC wasn't America's Broadcasting Corporation. It was Aaron's Broadcasting Corporation. But the phone call came from my friend Tom Mankiewicz, who had rewritten the original concept and changed a few things, and Robert Wagner, whom I had worked with before, and Aaron, who I knew because he coached our baseball team. So we used to have a celebrity baseball team as well. All the young actors would get together. We played for softball, a softball league. Nobody does that anymore. Nobody gets together. They called me, and we were in San Francisco. We were about to open in San Francisco on our way to Broadway as a sort of out of town opening in Cyrano. They offered this pilot. It was a pilot of Heart to Heart. And Aaron said, "Well, look, you know, there's a threat that there's going to be a newspaper strike in New York." And of course, when there's a newspaper strike in New York, nobody in the theater prospers from this because a new show, you can't get the publicity out for a new show. So nobody wants to open during a newspaper strike. Most of the time, it has very damaging effects to all the entertainment venues because you can't publicize anything. So as it turned out, so Aaron said, let's see what happens with the strike. All I can say is I'm extremely happy that there was a strike. So I could leave the cast of Cyrano and go on to do the pilot of Hard Time.
Amazing. So your friend Tom, so he rewrites Double Twist. That was the script that was around before.
Right. And he added the dog and he added Lionel and made it much more of a sort of Thin Man type of relationship.
Right. And Tom had written like 3 James Bond movies too, or like.
Yes, but he'd never directed. He was sort of the reluctant debutante. And so the only reason that you must rewrite this, but you also have to direct it. So everybody was pushing for him to direct because he was a natural. And he did, directed brilliantly. He directed a lot of our shows, but then he was offered a movie, and his first film was, mind you, he had rewritten Superman, he rewrote all kinds of movies. But the first film he directed was Dragnet with Tom Hanks and Dan Aykroyd.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
hilariously funny. To send up on everything. Then he worked with John Candy. They did a movie together, and he went on from there.
Awesome. So once you filmed the pilot, how long did you know before it was picked up?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it must have been a couple of months. Must have been.
Is that always like, when something like that happens, you film a pilot, are you under contract to have to wait a particular amount of time in case it does get picked up?
Well, it's different now than it was then. Clearly, you were sort of obliged to not make any other pilots until it either sold or didn't sell.
Okay, so but you got the power of spelling behind you. When did it become a hit? Because the first season it didn't blow up, but eventually it became a big show.
It started slowly, and because of the weight of Spelling and Goldberg, it wasn't cut, halfway through the first season, as sometimes happens with shows that aren't a runaway success. And so by the end of the season, we were picking up bigger and bigger audiences. So we went into the second season with already a larger audience waiting to see us. And then we started to fly.
Awesome. I read initially they maybe wanted Cary Grant instead of Robert Wagner, but he was maybe too old for the role. And then there were a few other potential Jennifer Harts.
I don't think that's actually right, because somebody may have made that up.
Okay.
Because Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood had a deal with Spelling and Goldberg. And part of that deal was X amount of movies for television that they would do for that enterprise and their company. And then they dusted off this old piece of property that they owned, which was called Double Twist. And they had the RJ read it as a potential for maybe he and Natalie to do as part of their deal. But Natalie didn't want to do that, felt it would be better. And then Tom was a great friend of both of theirs. So that all got into the mix, and that's how it got layered. But in the beginning, the network was thinking, Robert Wagner and Lindsay Wagner, Heart to Heart, and Wagner and Wagner. But our RJ and Tom championed me, and that's how I got the job.
And the rest is history. That such amazing chemistry you guys have. And then
We still do. We can still
you
make each
still
other laugh. I saw him yesterday.
you saw him yesterday. That's awesome. Yeah, because then you did the love letters together too, right? And after the Heart to Heart era or before the movies, the Heart to Heart movies.
Well, we did about 500 performances of love letters. We opened it in England, and there were riots in the street outside the theater. The police had to be called. It was really quite interesting. We were in Canada, we were in England, we were in Hawaii. We traveled a lot with that show.
It must be great just to be able to travel and work with someone who you get along with so well.
Yes, it's great. It's wonderful.
Lionel Stander. Tell me about Max. I know he's got
Well,
there's a rich history there.
History, don't you?
Yeah,
Do you
there
know a
was
bit about his
the
history?
American Committee or Un-American Committee, and
Oh no,
being
they're before
blackballed.
that. That sort of becomes his epitaph, but that really was not nearly as great as his other achievements were, although it was iconic what he said. And we'll go. It's still in the records, the congressional records, and he was absolutely right. It was a brilliant statement, but it got him blackballed. And so he wound up going to live in Italy because he'd been offered a movie in Italy. And in those days, there were lots and lots of, well, they used to call them runaway productions, but they really weren't running away so much as they were running to the source of funding. Because in those days, after the Second World War, all the countries in Europe had currency control. So you couldn't take any currency out of the country. It had to stay and remain in the country. So foreign investment or foreign products couldn't, the revenue from these foreign products couldn't be repatriated. So money was building up. The studio's money was building up overseas. So all of a sudden there was this pot of money to help finance other movies. And that was the way they could repatriate the funds that were locked in each one of those countries. And
Fascinating.
so that's kind of how Lawrence of Arabia was financed, how so many movies, Cleopatra was financed with frozen funds. It goes on and on and on, but that was the climate of the day. And there were lots of wildcat investors who were willing to put up some frozen funds for movies. And in Italy, of course, there were brilliant, absolutely brilliant filmmakers, Fellini, Vittorio De Sica, Visconti, all of those amazing, fabulous directors.
So Heart
So
to
to
Heart.
carry on with Lionel.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Lionel did, I think, over the years, I think he did some astonishing number of films in Italy. Not the least was of which was an incredibly good film that Roman Polanski directed with Catherine Deneuve's sister in it, François Dorlec, and it was called Cul-de-sac. It was and one of those great movies that should always be viewed as for film enthusiasts. So Lionel had an incredible. He also was the king of the Via Veneto. He lived with two blonde Swedish girls, and he had everywhere he went. He had his little twins on either side, you know, and he was an amazing character.
He lived it up, sounds like.
He did.
So Heart to Heart gets canceled kind of out of nowhere after the fifth season. There's some changes at the
Network.
At the
At
network.
the network.
But then 10 years later, you're able to, through these Heart to Heart reunion movies.
It was less than 10 years. It was less than 10 years. I think it was about 5.
Oh, 5 years? Okay.
Yeah, it was
So
about 5 years later.
so 5 years later, you get to do kind of did it felt good to kind of revisit and kind of
Oh, yes, it was
close
very
the
much. I think you were about to say put a period at the end of the sentence, and it was very much so. We did 8 2-hour movies.
That's a lot. I mean, in terms of like, you don't hear a lot of there was a period where they were doing a lot of reunion movies, but that's like almost like they brought you back as an ongoing series. I know it was part of originally that kind of mystery wheel. I read your book, and so
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, but I mean, but that's a lot. I mean, that's almost a whole season right there.
in today's world, yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, all right, so even more amazing. Let's talk about it. Also amazing is the William Holden Wildlife Foundation, which you founded.
I had the great experience of spending the last 10 years of his life with Bill Holden, William Holden. Bill was very much an adventurer. He loved to travel. He loved to, all his life, he was going to interesting places, wild places, places that are not, kind of up a river and with a lot of bugs and things, which I love to do as well. So we shared that thirst and curiosity and traveled a great deal together. His involvement in East Africa, in Kenya, began in the mid 50s when he went out there as a hunter with 2 friends when the game was prolific and no one ever thought that there'd ever be anything called an endangered species. The 3 of them decided to buy a hotel because they were all living in Switzerland at the time. And this was very accessible to them to go to this wonderful place. The flora and the fauna and the people were wonderful. And can you imagine in those days, the population was only 9 million people. So the whole country was like a playground. And so soon after he began to spend more time there, he realized that there was going to be a crisis. He was a visionary because in those days, before anybody had the word conservation in their vocabulary, or indeed extinction, Bill created the first ever game ranch for the preservation of species. He bought the 2,000 acres that surrounded the property where the hotel was and turned it into a game ranch for the preservation of the species that were once being hunted. And that was the first one in the whole of Africa, let alone, when you think about how innovative it was, probably going back to all those years, it was pretty rare for that thinking to cause somebody to devote that amount of territory to wildlife. I was very much an animal person because I had been raised by a stepfather who raised horses and collected exotic animals. And so it was nothing for me to rescue a baby bear from a pet shop in West Hollywood. Pretty interesting. That opened the world to me of wildlife rehabilitation that was going on, or at least the attempt for wildlife rehabilitation, and certainly the care of wild animals. That was a great world, and I never stepped out of it. So when Bill took me to East Africa, with him, I was already in love with the man, so it was very easy to fall in love with what he loved because I loved it too. When he died, he had always wanted to build a wildlife education center for local people to back up the specific preservation that was ongoing at the Mount Kenya Game Ranch. And so that component, that education component part of the puzzle, I created after his death. We currently serve first of all, let me say that our mission statement is wildlife conservation through education and alternatives to habitat destruction. Today, and for the bulk of the period of time that our doors have been open for free to Indigenous people only, we have serviced 10 to 11,000 students a year for all these years since 1982, and we received our IRS status as a public charity. We now have an outreach program, which we've had for a number of years, that goes into rural communities. So we're very much in the front lines of the human-animal crisis, the confrontation between tribal areas and wildlife. And so we serve there an additional 7,000 people or 6,500 people. So that's another sort of community activity, or at least in the wild, what's left of the wild. Our agricultural programs as alternatives to the habitat destruction are reaching a very interesting juncture, because we're now able to create soil regeneration and the regeneration of property that had been over chemicalized for small shareholding farmers, so that we can accelerate this process of regenerative soil and therefore farming techniques in one growing season, which is unheard of. It's very exciting work. I spend the bulk of my life there. I've invested a bulk of my life and my wherewithal there. It's an extraordinary gift to be able to share this information and these technologies with people who desperately need it, and with environments that are very fragile and in need of help.
That's amazing. I love that. I'll put a link to the whwf.org.
Thank you.
In the show notes, and anyone can head over there too. And I imagine there's a way to give and help support this amazing cause. You're a super wonderful person. Thank you. And I know you're being honored in Agents of Change award for this work as well. And I'm sure the real reward is also just all the amazing good that you're doing, and it's coming from it. The real reward is
there with people who are in the front lines. You know, my nails are short and dirty usually. So being in the field is where the work is done and where it's needed.
Stefanie Powers, you are amazing. Thank you. Thanks for spending time with me and sharing all this and enlightening us with the work that you're doing and all the cool stories that you shared. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Jeff.